Hi everybody, welcome back. So to kind of round out our discussion about identifying students based on risk factors that they might be exhibiting or that we might be aware of, I thought we might just talk for a couple of minutes about schools who, being aware of the same risk factors that we've all been talking about, attempt to identify students as early as they possibly can who may be students who need reading remediation, and to try to set up programs to help those students. So schools, and those of you who are in elementary school are probably aware that often schools have assessments that they will do on students upon entry into education altogether. So our pre-kindergartners, just to see if they can determine which of those students are going to need reading remediation and which ones of those students are going to encounter trouble. So there's been a lot of research done on the skills that schools can assess on those entering kindergartners that are going to correlate with later reading disabilities or success even. So it behooves us to think of what those skills are that have the highest correlation to student success, because of course those then are going to have the most promise as reliable determinants or reliable predictors of students. So they would be the skills that we would want to target in an assessment of our youngest little guys. So just to make sure before we go forward that we're all speaking the same language, if we're talking about a cause, we are talking about one thing that has caused something else to happen. There's a definite association between the outcome and the condition which brought it on. So, for example, what comes to my mind is we've had an awful lot of rain in the Baltimore region lately, and therefore a lot of people's basements have been flooding. So there's a definite cause there. The tremendous amount of rain is causing a lot of people to be having trouble with leaky basements right now. So there's a direct connection. On the other hand, we can talk about a correlation. And a correlation is when two or more variables tend to vary together, but yet there's not a situation where one of those variables is causing the other one. It's just the two seem to have a relationship. So, for example, if we think that there's been an awful lot of research on people who exercise first thing in the morning seem to be those people who are more apt to keep with an exercise routine. So there's a correlation between exercising in the morning and being consistent with an exercise routine. However, there's not a cause relationship there. Exercising in the morning is not causing people to stay with their exercise routine. So it's a correlation. There's a relationship between those two factors, but that's not a cause and effect. And then when we're talking about a predictor, we're talking about those situations or those conditions that we can measure that are going to predict for us reading difficulty or reading success with students. So we think of all those risk factors we've been talking about. We talk about the child, what's going on with the child's home, the child's school that they're in, and also the community that they're in. So when we're reporting on these factors, we're going to talk in terms of correlates. And correlates are generally reported on a scale of 0 to 1, and the closer that the number is to 1, the closer the connection between the two variables. So for instance, our example of people who exercise in the morning and maintaining an exercise program, there's going to be a higher correlation between those two things. So the number would be closer to 1. Okay, so now if we're thinking about our reading predictors, the correlate value for determining future reading success in a kindergartner based on whether he or she can point to a picture in response to a spoken word is presented with this equation, R equals 0.36. So 0.36, we can see that there is a correlation, but it's a relatively low one. So a child being able to point to a picture if we say, where's the book? And they can point to it. Now we're going to start with the strongest one first. Letter identification seems to be the strongest predictor of future student success on its own. And a quote here from the article Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children: just measuring how many letters a kindergartner is able to name when shown letters in a random order appears to be nearly as successful at predicting future reading as an entire reading readiness test. So isn't that interesting? Just the simple act of being able to identify letters in random order. And this is another quote that goes along with that. When approximately the bottom 20% of first graders were designated as having reading difficulties, 83.2% of those 1,000 students that they studied could have been correctly predicted based on letter recognition alone. So a very strong correlation there between letter identification at entry and future reading success. Verbal memory, or the ability to retain verbal information in that child's working memory, or that cognitive desktop that we talked about earlier. So on average, a kindergartner's ability to repeat sentences that he or she has heard, or to recall a brief story that was just read aloud to them, has a correlation of 0.45. So you can see that's getting stronger. So that's a pretty strong predictor of whether a child can hold that information in their verbal memory and repeat it. Expressive vocabulary, or confrontation naming, is the child's ability to accurately state a name for a picture shown to the child. So they're not just pointing now, they're verbalizing, they're saying the name of what you show them. So the magnitude and consistency of the results of those studies suggest that that naming vocabulary is a reliable predictor for future reading ability, and you can see the correlation is a 0.45. So again, it's a pretty strong connection there. Receptive language measures, such as measuring a student's sentence comprehension that emphasizes complex syntax or complex sentences, has been a successful predictor. So you say a sentence to a child that is rather complex and then ask them to show you that they understand what you've said. That would be that receptive language measure. So you're measuring how well they're receiving that language that you're sharing with them. The opposite kind of that is having them produce the language themselves. So that's their expressive language, and they're about equally as strongly a predictive measure. And that would be where you are measuring what the child vocalizes to you. So you're kind of keeping track of how many words they're saying, how many words they're putting into a sentence, how complex those sentences are, what are the vocabulary that they're using. So you're listening to the language that they're using. Now, phonological awareness, this is interesting. We were just talking about phonological awareness earlier and how it can be such a problem with students who are having reading difficulties. So remember, the phonological awareness is that ability just to hear the sounds and words and to manipulate them. But look, you would think that that would be a strong predictor because we just talked about how important that is for reading development. But on average, phonological awareness has been about as strong a predictor of future reading as memory for sentences and stories, confrontation naming, and general language measures. So those other measures we just talked about, phonological awareness is about right up there with them, so 0.46. So you would think, based on the conversation we just had, that phonological awareness might be a stronger predictor. But here's the thing. Think about our little babies as they're just entering school. They often have been hearing words and working with words and manipulating words, but possibly no one has ever asked them to pull those words apart, like we're going to do in phonological awareness. So if you remember, we talked about the good news with phonological awareness is that it can be taught. We're going to teach our babies those phonological awareness skills. So although it would be fantastic if they entered school with them, it's not necessarily a strong predictor of their reading success whether they already have those skills, because we are going to teach them and they can be learned to the students as we're going forward. So now it's not really appropriate to think that assessing any one of these skills is going to be an adequate predictor for future reading. Other than, remember we said that the letter naming, the random letter naming, seems to be the strongest predictor, but your more successful predictive measures are going to be a combination of several of those sub-skills. So schools, when they're thinking about what they're going to do to assess students right as they're coming in, they have to consider the time it's going to take to test the students and the cost associated with assessing all of the students. Perhaps they need to think about having a profile on the students as they're entering and be selective about the students that they might want to assess. Or if they're in a school that is generally in a low SES area or a low performing school anyway, then maybe we're going to bypass these measures before school starts and just know that we're going to be working with students who are going to struggle and just jump right in with teaching them that way. So again, a school has to consider what's their staffing and what's the time that they can allot to it, and certainly the cost of assessing all the students. However, gaining that information can be a really good assistance to teachers right from the start if they have some students that they're going to really, really keep an eye on because they've kind of been red flagged. But now a caution about predictors. First of all, treating the predictor itself isn't really the right approach. So if you think we just said that the letter naming is a really, really strong predictor, that doesn't mean that our kindergarten teachers, as soon as they're going to get those babies in front of them, are going to start practicing naming all of the letters. Certainly they're going to do that practice, but they're not going to do that over all of the other skills that they're going to teach. So they're not going to put an unnecessary amount of time into doing that. They're going to teach it, but they're going to remember everything else that they're supposed to teach. And then the bigger caution, I think, is to know that predictors do not imply the inevitability of poor reading achievement. Because remember, IQ is going to come into play in there and all those other factors that we talked about. So some students, even though they might start off with what appears to be low reading skills, are still going to be able to move forward quickly and are still going to take off. By the same token, we're also going to have those students that present in the beginning with learning those low foundational skills fairly quickly, but then they're going to fall off. So if we're looking at those predictors, we have to be aware that we're going to have students who are false positives and also false negatives. So we're going to have those students that we think are going to struggle and yet they don't really, and we have those students that we think are going to be fine and yet they start to hit a wall. So we just want to take, predictors with the grain of salt and know that they're not a perfect science, but they are a way to kind of give us a little bit of a leg up with our students who are entering and knowing which ones we're really, really going to keep an eye on. Okay, so now moving forward for you with your module, your next job is to respond to the reflection on the risk factors and the predictors now that you've been through the work, the coursework, the classwork of the module. Then your reading assignment this week is moving us into taking a look at the brain research, which is one of my favorite topics because I find it so fascinating. You're going to start off with reading in chapter 1 of your book, pages 24 to 29. That's going to talk about some of those cognitive models. And then you're going to read an interview with Dr. Sally Shaywitz, who is one of the leading brain researchers who has connected brain research with reading instruction and reading ability. It's kind of a lengthy interview, but I think you're going to get a lot of interesting information out of that interview. And then after you read those things, there's a discussion board for you to respond to. It's called Discussion about the Reading Brain, and I'll look forward to seeing what you guys have to say with that. And I will see you next week. So take care.